The house on Maple Ridge Road. The call came at 6:12 in the morning, the kind of hour when nothing good ever happens. Margaret Lewis stared at her phone while it vibrated across the nightstand, the name unknown caller, flashing like a warning she didn't want to hear. She almost let it go to voicemail. But something inside her, a quiet, tired instinct built from 62 years of loss and responsibility, told her to answer. "Mrs. Lewis?" a man's voice said, formal and careful. "I'm calling from Caldwell and Pierce Law offices. I'm afraid your father passed away late last night." The room went silent. Not dramatic silent. Not movie silent. Just the heavy kind that settles into your chest. Her father had been dead to her for 30 years. And yet now he was really gone. "We need you to come in," the lawyer continued. "There's an inheritance. And there are things you should know." Margaret pressed her hand against her mouth. Because she had buried her father long before the funeral home ever would. And whatever he'd left behind, she wasn't sure she wanted it. What she didn't know yet, what she couldn't possibly imagine, was that the inheritance waiting for her wouldn't just reopen old wounds. It would tear apart everything she thought she knew about her family. And by the time she understood the truth, someone she loved might already be gone. The woman who learned to live alone. Margaret lived in a small Ohio town where people still waved at each other from pickup trucks, and everyone knew whose porch light stayed on past midnight. She worked at a hardware store. Not because she had dreamed of it, but because after her divorce at 53, stability mattered more than dreams. Her ex-husband, Daniel, had left quietly. No screaming. No shattered dishes. Just a letter on the kitchen table explaining he'd fallen in love with someone younger. That kind of betrayal didn't explode. It settled slowly like dust. Her son Tyler lived 2 states away and called when he remembered. Her daughter Claire visited more often, though lately even those visits had become shorter. Rushed, distracted. Margaret told herself it was normal. Kids grow up. They move on. Still, evenings felt longer than they used to. The only person she spoke to regularly was George, a widower who owned the diner near the highway. They weren't a couple. Not exactly. But sometimes he saved her a booth by the window. Sometimes she laughed in ways she didn't remember how to anymore. And sometimes, late at night, she wondered if life could start again at 62. The man she refused to remember. Her father, Harold Lewis, had vanished when she was 27. One day he was there. A strict, quiet man who worked construction and rarely showed emotion. The next he was gone. No explanation. Just a note that said, "I need to fix something I broke a long time ago." Her mother never forgave him. Margaret tried not to think about him at all. When her mother died of cancer 15 years later, Margaret had assumed that chapter was closed forever. Until the lawyer called. The will. The office smelled like old paper and expensive coffee. Mr. Caldwell was younger than she expected. Maybe late 40s. With tired eyes that suggested he'd seen more family drama than he cared to admit. "Your father left you the house," he said, sliding a folder across the table. "House?" "The property on Maple Ridge Road." Margaret frowned. "That house burned down when I was a kid." "No," he said gently. "It didn't." He turned the folder toward her. Photographs. A large white farmhouse. Fresh paint. A wide porch. It looked alive. She stared at it, confused. "My mother said he sold it." Mr. Caldwell hesitated. "There are several things your father asked me to give you personally. He believed you deserved the truth." The truth. She felt something cold move through her. What truth? The lawyer slid a small brass key across the desk. "He asked you to visit the house before we discussed anything further." The drive back. Maple Ridge Road sat 30 minutes outside town, where fields stretched into quiet hills and the sky felt bigger than the rest of the world. Margaret hadn't been there in decades. The gravel crunched under her tires as she pulled into the driveway. The house looked nothing like the burned-out memory she carried. Someone had taken care of it. Loved it. The porch steps creaked as she climbed them. The key felt heavy in her hand. When she opened the door, the smell of old wood and sunlight wrapped around her. Furniture stood exactly where it used to. Her father's chair. Her mother's piano. Dust danced in the air like time had paused just for her. And then she saw the box. Sitting on the kitchen table. A cardboard box sealed with tape and a note in her father's careful handwriting. For Margaret. Open when you're ready. Her chest tightened. She didn't feel ready. But she opened it anyway. Inside were photographs, letters, and a birth certificate that made her hands tremble. The name printed under father wasn't Harold Lewis. It was someone else. Someone she had never heard of. And in that moment, everything she thought she knew about her family began to fall apart. A secret older than her marriage. Margaret sat at the kitchen table for hours reading her mother's letters, her father's notes, fragments of a story that refused to stay quiet. She learned that Harold had married her mother knowing she was pregnant with another man's child. He had raised her as his own, never telling a soul. The real father had disappeared before she was born. Her mother had begged Harold to keep the secret, and he had. For decades, Margaret felt anger rise inside her, not at Harold, but at the silence that had shaped her life. Why had no one told her? Why had her mother taken that truth to the grave? She wiped tears from her face and turned another page. A newer letter, dated only 6 months ago. My health is failing, Harold had written. And there's something else you need to know. The house and the inheritance are not only yours. Her heart skipped. Not only yours. She turned the page. And when you meet her, please don't hate her for my mistakes. Margaret's breath caught. Who was she? The unexpected visitor. The knock came just before sunset. Margaret wasn't expecting anyone. She opened the door slowly. A woman stood there, mid-40s, dark hair pulled into a loose ponytail, eyes that looked strangely familiar. Margaret, she asked. Yes. The woman swallowed. I'm Anna. The name didn't mean anything. Until she said the next words. I think I'm your sister. Margaret laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it felt impossible. My father didn't have other kids. Anna held out a folder. He did. The papers inside confirmed it. A birth certificate. The same father's name Margaret had just discovered in the box. Their biological father. The man neither of them had ever known. Margaret felt the ground shift beneath her. What do you want? She whispered. Anna's eyes filled with tears. I just want to understand why he left us both behind. The first twist. They sat at the kitchen table like strangers bound by a secret neither had chosen. Anna explained she'd grown up in California, raised by a single mother who never spoke about Margaret's family. She had only discovered the connection when Harold contacted her 2 years earlier. He said he was trying to make things right before it was too late, Anna said. Margaret felt anger flare. He never tried with me. Anna hesitated. He said you hated him. The words hit harder than she expected. As maybe she had. What else did he tell you? Margaret asked. Anna looked toward the hallway. There's a room upstairs. He said not to open it until we were both here. Margaret's stomach tightened. A locked room. Another secret. They climbed the stairs slowly, every step heavy with anticipation. The door at the end of the hall stood closed. A second key hung from a nail beside it. Margaret hesitated. What if we don't want to know? Anna whispered. What if this is the only chance we ever get? Margaret turned the key. The door creaked open. And what she saw inside made her knees buckle. The room of memories. The walls were covered in photographs. Hundreds of them. Margaret as a child. Anna as a teenager. Tyler and Claire. Every birthday. Every milestone. Harold had been watching them. From a distance. There were newspaper clippings about Margaret's wedding. A program from Claire's graduation. Even a faded photo of Margaret sitting in George's diner, taken through a window. He knew everything, Anna whispered. Margaret felt a wave of grief crash over her. He hadn't abandoned her completely. He had just stayed away. Why? On a desk near the window sat a tape recorder. And beside it, a note. If you're here together, press play. Margaret hesitated. Then she pressed the button. Harold's voice filled the room, older, weaker, but unmistakable. I don't expect forgiveness, he said. But you deserve the truth. The truth that changed everything. Harold explained how he had discovered Margaret wasn't biologically his only after she turned 18. How he stayed anyway. How he later found out he had another daughter, Anna, from the same man. Their biological father had been dangerous, involved in criminal activity that had put both families at risk. Harold left not because he stopped loving Margaret, but because someone had threatened her. I thought staying away would keep you safe, his voice said. Margaret's chest tightened. All those years of silence had been protection? But then came the words that shifted everything again. The inheritance isn't just a house, Harold continued. It's proof. Proof that the man who hurt our family finally faced justice. And you'll need to decide what to do with what he left behind. Margaret stopped the tape. What does that mean? Anna asked. Margaret didn't answer. She didn't know yet. But she felt the story moving toward something bigger. Something darker. And she wasn't sure she was ready. The second half begins. The next morning they returned to the lawyer's office together. Mr. Caldwell looked relieved to see them side by side. Your father hoped this would happen, he said quietly. He slid another document forward. A trust fund. Worth more money than Margaret had ever imagined. Originating from a settlement tied to their biological father. A man who had died years earlier after a long legal battle. Margaret felt sick. So this is blood money, she said. In a way, the lawyer replied gently. But Harold insisted it be used for something meaningful. Anna's hands trembled. What are we supposed to do with it? Mr. Caldwell met Margaret's eyes. That is entirely up to you. The midpoint twist. Margaret thought the biggest secret had already been revealed. She was wrong. Because later that evening Claire, her daughter, arrived at the house unexpectedly. I need to talk to you, Claire said, avoiding eye contact. Margaret felt dread settle into her stomach. What's wrong? Claire's voice cracked. I knew about the inheritance before you did. The words landed like a blow. What? I found letters from Grandpa last year, Claire admitted. He asked me not to tell you until he passed away. Margaret stared at her. You lied to me? Claire's eyes filled with tears. I thought he was trying to fix something. I didn't want to hurt you. Margaret's chest tightened. Another betrayal. Another secret. And suddenly the inheritance didn't feel like a gift. Felt like a test. One that might tear the entire family apart. The emotional breaking point near the end. Months later, Margaret discovered that Anna had quietly used part of the inheritance to pay off Claire's medical debts. Debts Claire had hidden from everyone after a serious diagnosis. Margaret felt betrayed again. But when she confronted Anna, she finally understood. Anna wasn't trying to take anything. She was trying to build a family she'd never had. That night, Margaret listened to the last tape Harold had recorded. If you're hearing this, his voice said softly, then you've already faced more pain than I ever wanted for you. But remember, family isn't blood. It's the people who choose to stay. Margaret cried harder than she had in years. Because for the first time she realized she had spent her life pushing people away out of fear of being left. The cathartic resolution. Margaret decided to turn the farmhouse into a community space. A place for people rebuilding their lives after loss. She invited Anna to run it with her. She forgave Claire. She even called Tyler, admitting she hadn't always been the easiest mother to love. And one evening, sitting in George's diner, she finally said the words she'd been afraid of. I don't want to spend the rest of my life alone. George smiled, nervous like a teenager. Good, he said. Because neither do I. The ending, a lesson earned, not given. Years later, Margaret stood on the porch of the Maple Ridge house, watching families gather for a community dinner. Anna laughed with Claire in the yard. George grilled burgers beside Tyler. The past wasn't erased. The secrets didn't disappear. But they had become something else. Understanding. Because Margaret finally learned something her father had tried to tell her all along. Sometimes the truth arrives too late to fix yesterday, but it can still save tomorrow. And the greatest inheritance isn't money or property. It's the courage to break the silence that keeps people apart.